I just put on a shirt for this video so that you would know this is a different day, and then realised that I looked like I was wearing a grandmother's blouse, which was also unfortunate because I have worn that shirt to work. In fact, I actually bought it from work. So now I have something that has to go back to the charity shop. Hi everyone, my name is Charlie, and today I have my September wrap-up. September has been a strange month in terms of reading because the first 2 weeks I had a solid amount of reading every spare moment I had, and then that petered out because of one book that sent me into, I said the other day, not a reading slump, but reading became more of a slog. I wasn't looking forward to it, and it was all due to an experience I had with one book. But we will get to that book in a minute or two, or 5. It's quite a way away yet. The first book that I read in September was Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. I won't be talking about this one as I did finish it on the 1st of September and I included it in my August wrap-up. The next book is a buddy read, and that is Melmoth by Sarah Perry. I read this book with Abby of Abby Mac Reads, and I believe that had I not buddy read this book, I would not have got as much out of it as I did. This book has an omniscient narrator really, but from the blur we're led to believe that the main character is Helen Franklin. One day she is walking through the streets of Prague and she meets a friend. He is somewhat agitated and he gives her this manuscript, and he believes that his life is now being haunted by this fictional dark spirit called Melmoth. You have this sense that Helen has isolated herself from the world for a very specific reason. As you will know if you've followed my channel for a length of time, I did not particularly get on with the Essex Serpent, Sarah Perry's previous book. However, a lot of other people did, and when Melmoth came out, they weren't giving this book favourable reviews, and I thought that that was fantastic because what they weren't liking about this book sounded exactly what I would like about this book, and because I hadn't liked the Essex Serpent, I thought, well, then probably the way things will work, I will like Melmoth. And I was right. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. It is dark, it goes back in time, and it looks at people's stories throughout the generations to tell this story of Melmoth, and you get this idea that it's not necessarily a book about one particular character. It's about people who have committed the worst atrocities, really searching for some sort of forgiveness in themselves. Stylistically, this book was a bit difficult to get into. However, I also found the Essex Serpent difficult to get into. But I think that once you got into this book, then everything worked out and the narrator's voice began to make sense in terms of the overall story. I would send messages to Abby about something, she'd send messages to me, and I think that as we began to unpick this story, it began to make more sense to us. And not just that, but it began to mean more to us as well. And I know that had I read this on my own, I definitely would not have got the same out of it. Had I read this book as quickly as I usually read, then I probably would have missed a lot. I'm incredibly grateful to Abby actually, because she kept patient with me as I would undoubtedly miss deadlines for pages we'd said we'd read. The same thing happened with another book I buddy read this month, and we'll get to that as well. I think that this is a dark gothic tale that a lot of people haven't looked at because they have thought that it's not as good as the Essex Serpent. I like it because it's not just one story, it's all these different stories coming together to tell this overall narrative about this character of Melmoth. I like that it went into history and it gained this sort of dark fairy tale aspect about it. There was something folkloric about it that I also particularly enjoyed. It had this sense of the supernatural without being too fantastical, if that makes any sense, which I feel as though was perfectly suited to this story. It reminded me of the things that I like within Joanne Harris, and because of that, I found myself particularly enthusiastic about this book. Next, I read Swan Song by Kerry Andrew. This follows the character of Polly Vaughan as she escapes to Scotland after something dark has happened in London. She is a student and you get this sense that she has spent all of her time at uni so far imbibing alcohol, getting drunk, getting reckless, taking drugs, doing all that fun stuff that students are supposed to do, but she hasn't been particularly caring about her education. And now she's in Scotland. And at first, I thought this book was a bit like Fleabag with supernatural elements. I once unhauled this book. However, I decided to give it a second chance. Because of Monsterathon this month, that I failed at, and we won't talk about, and I'm very sorry about that, I decided to read this book. I thought that I was going to get something similar to Melmoth with the folklore and this darker fairy tale aspect, and I didn't. And all of that fairy tale stuff seems to have happened before the book, and then it doesn't come into the book or into sort of any context until the final maybe 30 pages of this book. This book doesn't really get started until the 150 page mark. It seems to have a really long introduction where you think the story's going one way, and then out of nowhere it decides to change and switch trajectories. And it baffled me. It made no sense. I felt as though it just needed that start removing, but then I just don't think it's any good. Honestly, I know that this is a really horrible thing to say. I'm almost apologetic about that, but as we know, my space to review books and give you my thoughts and opinions. My thoughts and opinions are that the character voice in this book is incredibly strong, and I was appreciative of that, and I liked that character voice. However, I felt as though the author strove to include fairy tale aspects and elements that didn't necessarily work for the story anymore. They felt as though they'd been forced in there to create some sort of unnecessary magic. I just wish that the characters had had some growth, and I don't feel like they had any sort of growth at all. And also, because of the strong character voice in the beginning, I didn't necessarily want it to dwindle, but I needed it to go somewhere, and I needed there to be some sort of change in the characters, and I didn't get that. I just feel as though I got the same characters doing stupid stuff throughout that was incredibly nonsensical, and in the end, I appreciate the character voice, but I just think that the book fell flat for me. Next, we have Malamander by Thomas Taylor. This book is a middle grade fiction following the character of Herbie Lemon, who works in the basement of the Grand Nautilus Hotel in the Lost and Found. One day, Violet Palmer slips through his window, and she is on the run from a boat hook man. And then this story follows them as they go on this very fast quest throughout Erie-on-Sea in their search for the Malamander so that they can find Violet Palmer's parents. If I had had this book when I was a child, I would have been thrilled, because this was a magnificent adventure. I really enjoyed the portrayal of these two children as they went about their strange lives in this small seaside town. I was really appreciative of the seaside town aspect, actually. I know that it's perhaps probably set down south, but I kept imagining Whitby because, as we know, I have a mild affection for Whitby. First, I didn't know that this book was going to be part of a series, so that was one aspect where I thought, how are all the mysteries going to be solved in this one book? I didn't know that. This was, for me, somewhat like Scooby-Doo mixed with magic. And the magical aspects were really well done. I don't know how to explain it, really. It was very visual, and it was very much the type of middle grade fiction that I like to read and I like to see. There were ghostly apparitions, there were things going back into the past. Again, we had the folklore. Apparently this month has just been about folklore, but this was more just suited to the town. It was these little tales that end up perpetuated throughout your town, and it just really worked well. for this story. So yeah, I have found another children's book that I quite like, and if you are participating in Gavin Hetherington's Believe-a-thon in November, then I suggest this as a read because it was rather marvellous, really. Next I read The Wolves in the Walls by Neil Gaiman, illustrated by Dave McKean. This is about this girl who hears wolves in the walls, and one night they come out. And it begins as this tale which is a bit like Peter and the Wolf, where she's going and she's telling her parents that she can hear the wolves and they don't believe her. And then one day the wolves come out of the walls. And I found it particularly humorous. I wouldn't necessarily read it again. I may one day share it with my nephew because I feel as though he might find it darkly humorous when he's a bit older. But I don't really think there's much more that I can say than that. I enjoy Neil Gaiman. I thought this was as surreal as his other works. Next, I read Mr. Punch, again written by Neil Gaiman and illustrated by Dave McKean. And this book was rather dark, and I did not enjoy it. I can appreciate dark books, but this one just felt a bit dreary to me. I can't say what it was that I didn't like, but I just didn't like it, and sometimes that happens with books. Then I read Dumb Witness by Agatha Christie. This woman writes to Hercule Poirot to tell him she's a bit suspicious of the people around her, that they might have tried to kill her. And then Poirot receives the letter a bit too late, and by the time he gets to her house, she's already dead. There's this suspicion surrounding a new will and how she was going to split her money up between people. I'd previously seen Dane of Dane Reads talk about this book, in which he said the whole dumb witness aspect makes no sense, and I agree with that. They make out as though the dog is somehow going to be important in the title, but yeah, he isn't. And I know that I'm not the biggest fan of Poirot as opposed to Miss Marple. I feel as though they're a bit convoluted, and as I say when I read them, I have to remember that I once heard they're a satire of Sherlock Holmes, and that is probably the only way that I can cope with them. I guessed where this story was going to go from the off, and that is once again because I've read a lot of Agatha Christie now, and I found that she sometimes reuses her motives and her plots, which is fine. I imagine as writers we all do this. I haven't written nearly in as much as she has to have to notice it yet. I feel as though this story was blown out. It could have been a lot shorter. It takes a lot of time to actually get anywhere. Again, it could have all started about 100 pages in and it would not have mattered because they constantly go back over the story you've already been told. Next, I read Hercule Poirot's Christmas. I should not have read this book so close to Dumb Witness because, again, we have a family and the head of this family lets everyone know that he's going to leave them nothing in the will, and then he's killed. Once again, I guessed who the killer was going to be. Once again, I was disappointed by the knowledge of who that killer was, and I've previously heard it said that a lot of people started guessing who Agatha Christie's murderers were because it was always the one you'd least expect. And that was certainly the case here. What I've begun to dislike with the Agatha Christie books is this presentation of suspects, and then most of the time it's never any of the suspects, simply because she wants to go out of her way to give you this exposition and this reason why it has to be this other person who's the culprit. And sometimes I just think that narrative-wise, if you haven't plotted that immediately, it's going to show, and it definitely does show in these books. And I think I'll always have a soft spot for her stories. Didn't like it. As you can see, we're beginning a pattern of reading books that I didn't like, and because of that, I ended up in a reading slump, but there is one book in particular. We're just a few books away. Next, I read The Hollow by Agatha Christie, and this book could have been fantastic had she not included Poirot. After I read this, I actually went and looked it up, because there are some great themes and ideas within this book that I wish she'd explored more, And I found out Agatha Christie says in her autobiography she ruined her best book by including Poirot, and I agree with that sentiment. This needn't have been the classic murder mystery. This could have easily been a thriller on the same level as Patricia Highsmith. And she ruined it again by including Poirot. Once again, murderer is incredibly easy to figure out. I actually realised Poirot had absolutely no agency in this story at all, because the way that the story goes, the reader would have found out the murderer if Poirot hadn't been present. Spoilers, maybe, possibly, but the reason behind this is that somebody goes and has a chat with the murderer, and then Poirot walks in like, "Oh yeah, I knew it was you." I maybe just threw a book. Next, I read The Clocks, also by Agatha Christie. This agency receives a phone call asking them to send a specific person to Mrs. Pedmarsh's house at a specific time. When she arrives, she finds a murdered man that Mrs. Pedmarsh is not aware of because she is blind. She doesn't realise he's there. Also, all these clocks have stopped at a specific time, but none of the clocks were there before. This is a more modern Hercule Poirot story. It's set, I believe, in the late 50s, early 60s. The change in tone is very noticeable. Again, I didn't like it. There's this weird plot that somehow involves spies, and at this point I really think that Poirot should have been retired. I know that he is actually technically retired in this one, and this guy's just come along like, "Oh yeah, I actually know who murdered the person, but I just wanted to give you something to do, mate." It's very easy to get through. Agatha Christie writes very accessible fiction. There's not a lot going on in the story. They're very much like reading scripts because they're mostly dialogue, which also makes it difficult because then all the clues are really very noticeable as well. It's a no for this one as well. Whilst I was reading all of these books, I was also reading The Dragon Republic by R.F. Kuang. I split this book up between reading from the copy I had from the library and listening to the audiobook, as I did with The Poppy War. This is a book that is also due a reread. The Poppy War begins with a very hopeful student, but immediately you're aware that it's quite dark. And then for its second and third parts, there is this major shift that seems to come out of nowhere. And I felt as though the same sort of thing was happening with The Dragon Republic, but this one, there was just so much more torture, so much more violence, so much more war. I didn't think that I could cope with it. From reading Robin Hobb, I have seen writers torture their characters before. I have not seen them torture their characters to the lengths that R.F. Kuang goes to when she shows the levels of war and violence within her books. Sometimes it was difficult to listen to and difficult to read, but I liked to see the growth of the characters. This story begins with Rin being somewhat disgraced after committing a huge act at the end of the Poppy War, and therefore I can't talk about the book much without spoiling it, but it's strange to see this story where there are no friends and there are no enemies and you don't know who you can trust as a reader because everybody has their own ideas as to how this war should go. And Rin is constantly looking to put her faith in people. This story takes away everything that has made Rin who she is in the Poppy War and has have to rebuild herself. I found myself really just struggling with the harshness and the difficulties presented to the characters within these books, but I think that that's to the writer's favour. I honestly believe that this is just a brilliant fantasy series so far. I know it's not for everyone, but Lord, is it dark and violent and just brilliant. And now we reach the book that sent me on to my reading slog. That meant I have only read 2 books since the 15th of September. And that is The Santa Claus Murder by Mavis Doriel-Hey. This entire family is coming together because the father has decided that he wants to celebrate Christmas with a proper Santa Claus, and so he gets one of his son-in-laws to dress up as Santa Claus, and then he ends up killed by someone dressed up as Santa Claus. Once again, we have a story that is terrible. I mean, this didn't even read like fiction, it just read as long lists of things, and sometimes you get the same bits of information over and over again just repeated to you, and then when the detective finally comes into it after you've heard the written statements of the family, you just end up getting things presented to you, and you know, it's just facts told to you throughout the entire thing, and you get no sense of character from any of the characters, and there's quite a lot of them. You get no sense of place, no sense of story. It's all just told in this very mundane style that honestly left me bored to tears, and I would have DNF'd it, but I already DNF'd and gave away another book off my coordinated TBR this month, and I wish that I'd probably stuck with that one over this. Honestly, when I finished this book, I said I can understand why this went out of print and nobody knew about it for years, until the British Library decided that they needed to bring out another crime classic for Christmas. Next, I read Canary Row by John Steinbeck, and this book was fantastic. I was supposed to buddy read this book with Dane of Dane Reads, and unfortunately, he said let's just read 25 pages a day and, you know, get through it that way. Dane finished this book about 3 weeks before I finished it, and we didn't talk about it at all. But this story follows all these people on Canary Row as they decide to throw Doc a party. It goes into all their lives, and it felt a bit like, it reminded me of almost a cowboy caper, and it just, I don't know what it was. It was so short, it was funny, but the writing was just fantastic. I mean, I'm a fan of Steinbeck anyway. I'd never read this one, and Dane mentioned that he was going to read it. He's like, if you can get a copy by Tuesday, we can buddy read it. I was like, yeah, fine. So I went to the library and got a copy, and then we didn't buddy read it because I'm an idiot. But either way, I love this book, and I need to get my own copy of it so that I can reread it. I really enjoyed this comic caper about community, and that's alliteration for you. Oh, the last book that I finished in September was Men at Arms by Terry Pratchett. This is, I don't know how many books into the Discworld series now, but we are returned to the Night Watch, and all of the characters that we last saw in Guards. If you remember, I thoroughly enjoyed that book. It was humorous, and it reminded me of Police Academy. And this book does exactly the same sort of thing. It has Terry Pratchett's classic humour. It takes certain elements of fantasy, twists them on their head, and makes them appropriate for the Discworld. And we were getting our first sense of a murder mystery really with this one, and I appreciated that as well. Again, this is a book that I need my own physical edition of, because I think that I really like the watch books, whatever they're called, within the Discworld. I think that I might have found the ones I enjoy the most. I also just want to say that I did read Acumen 95. This is a literary journal. My good friend Joy Winkler has a poem in here, page 80, and so she lent this to me to see what poetry editors are accepting, because as we know, I'm trying to get my poetry out there. We actually submitted our poetry to 2 journals at the same time, and it was a funny story to me because I got rejected by Acumen and Joy got accepted by them, and then I got accepted by Butcher's Dog and Joy got rejected by Butcher's Dog. And when that happened, I felt as though there was some sort of karmic balance in the world. It might have been the only time I've been a bit metaphysical and spiritual, but it worked for me. So as you might know, I went into September with big aspirations that I didn't meet. I was supposed to read Dracula this month, and that didn't happen. I started it and I got 4 pages in, and after reading the Santa Claus murder, it just wasn't happening. I do find it a bit difficult to get into that one, but I will give it a try. We're about to head into Victober, so I might be able to read it for that, but you've seen my TBR already, quite jam-packed. Either way, I did start reading Once Upon a River at the start of this month, and so I'm 200 pages in, and I'm looking to finish this one today. And yesterday, because for no other reason than I was looking for something light to read, I picked up Soulbinder by Sebastien de Castell, and I'm currently 90 pages into this one. I definitely will not be finishing this one before October, before Victober, so we might have an October that actually has Soulbinder in it alongside a load of Victorian literature. And I'm also currently 220 pages into Clariel by Garth Nix. Again, this was because I wanted something fantastical to read, but again, I really enjoyed the first 100 pages of this and mentioned it in a video that I was enjoying it, and it but then it slipped back into this vernacular that I noticed with Garth Nix's earlier works that I just find too formal for fiction, and that might be a horrible thing to say. Is there anything too formal for fiction? If there is, then it's this. I'm going to try and finish it at some point, but today is not that day. That wrap up took a lot longer than anticipated. If you've read any of these books and would like to discuss them, then please feel free to do so in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.